Well, I am here with Davy. Hi, Davy.
Hey, Al.
Anna.
Hey.
Laynie Browne.
Hi.
Hi. And Jerome Rothenberg. Jerry, how are you?
It's fine.
Really good to see you. We're going to talk about Jerome Rothenberg's poem, A Poem of Fears, in 7 installments. I had not seen this until I saw this book, which is called Retrievals, Uncollected and New Poems, 1955 to 2000, covers a lot of years. And in this book, I found this remarkable poem, and I'm so excited that Jerry's here and willing to talk about it. But first, here's Jerry reading the poem.
A Poem of Fears in 7 installments. 1. Some had a fear of men. Some had a fear of women. Some had a fear of girls. Some had a fear of children. Some had a fear of tyrants. Some had a fear of priests. Some had a fear of popes. Some had a fear of people. Some had a fear of crowds. Some had a fear of mobs. Some had a fear of robbers. Some had a fear of foreigners. Some had a fear of Englishmen. Some had a fear of French. Some had a fear of Germans. Some had a fear of Japanese. Some had a fear of Jews. Some had a fear of Negroes. Some had a fear of Russians. Some had a fear of Chinese. Some had a fear of God. Some had a fear of Satan. Some had a fear of demons. Some had a fear of ghosts. Some had a fear of spirits. 2. Some had a fear of cats. Some had a fear of dogs. Some had a fear of horses. Some had a fear of mice. Some had a fear of bulls. Some had a fear of animals. Some had a fear of reptiles. Some had a fear of snakes. Some had a fear of birds. Some had a fear of fish. Some had a fear of worms. Some had a fear of mites. Some had a fear of bees. Some had a fear of spiders. Some had a fear of insects. Some had a fear of lice. Some had a fear of microbes. Some had a fear of bacteria. Some had a fear of germs. Some had a fear of monsters. 3. Some had a fear of flowers. Some had a fear of flutes. Some had a fear of bullets. Some had a fear of needles. Some had a fear of crystals. Some had a fear of mirrors. Some had a fear of pins. Some had a fear of dust. Some had a fear of strings. Some had a fear of dirt. Some had a fear of corpses. Some had a fear of water. Some had a fear of metal. Some had a fear of gold. Some had a fear of money. Some had a fear of machinery. Some had a fear of vehicles. Some had a fear of telephones. Some had a fear of hair. Some had a fear of skin. Some had a fear of fur. Some had a fear of teeth. Some had a fear of eyes. Some had a fear of beards. Some had a fear of feathers. Some had a fear of rectums. Some had a fear of slime. Some had a fear of feces. Some had a fear of blood. Some had a fear of urine. Some had a fear of food. Some had a fear of drink. Some had a fear of drugs. Some had a fear of poison. Some had a fear of small things. Some had a fear of new things. Some had a fear of one thing. Some had a fear of everything. 4. Some had a fear of comets. Some had a fear of sun. Some had a fear of stars. Some had a fear of gravity. Some had a fear of lightning. Some had a fear of thunder. Some had a fear of wind. Some had a fear of drafts. Some had a fear of fog. Some had a fear of clouds. Some had a fear of snow. Some had a fear of floods. Some had a fear of waves. Some had a fear of cold. Some had a fear of heat. Some had a fear of fire. Some had a fear of light. Some had a fear of dawn. Some had a fear of darkness. Some had a fear of shadows. Some had a fear of night. Some had a fear of body odor. Some had a fear of ice and frost. 3. Some had a fear of closed places. Some had a fear of heights. Some had a fear of precipices. Some had a fear of rivers. Some had a fear of the sea. Some had a fear of churches. Some had a fear of homes. Some had a fear of heaven. Some had a fear of hell. 6. Some had a fear of crossing a street. Some had a fear of crossing a bridge. Some had a fear of passing high buildings. Some had a fear of going to bed. Some had a fear of coitus. Some had a fear of work. Some had a fear of writing. Some had a fear of sleep. Some had a fear of stealing. Some had a fear of speech. Some had a fear of swallowing. Some had a fear of soiling. Some had a fear of standing. Some had a fear of being idle. Some had a fear of taste. Some had a fear of touch. Some had a fear of smell. Some had a fear of thinking. Some had a fear of trembling. Some had a fear of ridicule. Some had a fear of a beating. Some had a fear of smothering. Some had a fear of inoculation. Some had a fear of children. Some had a fear of death. Some had a fear of music. Some had a fear of sin. 7. Some had a fear of sourness. Some had a fear of sharpness. Some had a fear of narrowness. Some had a fear of weakness. Some had a fear of dampness. Some had a fear of pain. Some had a fear of justice. Some had a fear of freedom. Some had a fear of pleasure. Some had a fear of fatigue. Some had a fear of poverty. Some had a fear of fear. Some had a fear of punishment. Some had a fear of color. Some had a fear of duration. Some had a fear of motion. Some had a fear of symmetry. Some had a fear of speed. Some had a fear of loneliness. Some had a fear of ruin. Some had a fear of imperfection. Some had a fear of responsibility. Some had a fear of failure. Some had a fear of sex. Some had a fear of marriage. Some had a fear of heredity. Some had a fear of nudity. Some had a fear of ideas. Some had a fear of words. Some had a fear of names. Some had a fear of philosophy. Some had a fear of magic. Some had a fear of infinity. Some had a fear of the void.
Wow. Thank you, Jerry. We'll start with Davy, Laynie, and Anna, just some opening thoughts, and then we'll turn to Jerry, who by that time will have caught his breath. Davy, your first thought?
Well, something that's so interesting and exciting about all of the different entities that some had a fear of is different expectations about what people's responses are. So someone who has a fear of heights and someone who has a fear of Jews might be understood to be reacting in really different ways. And so when are these situations where we assume that someone might be avoiding something, someone might be inflicting a form of self-harm, someone might be inflicting a form of interpersonal harm, what are some of the different ways that behaviors as a result of these fears manifest, and on what scale do they manifest?
Yeah, good. Wonderful, thank you. Laynie, what's your thought, your first thought?
I was thinking about the categorizing into 7 groups and how we have lists that start out similar, and then there seems to be a turn towards the end of every list, a turn, from animals to something imaginary. In each list it's slightly different to what the turn is, but it makes me wonder about the relationships between the things that we fear and how maybe that's not rational.
Yeah.
But also I'm thinking about what is the importance of this 7, there are 7 lists, and what does that have to say about people, if anything?
Can I follow up with a quick question?
Yeah.
We all, as we were listening and reading, we're starting to work out what the categories are, and then, of course, the genius of this poem is that we had to give up after a while because of this very thing you're saying about the quality of fear. I guess I said something. Do you want to? Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think towards the end we have a broadening, right? And we have different types of specificity in each list that change towards the end of each list. There's always something that we wouldn't expect.
Right.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Anna, your thought on this before we turn to Jerry?
Oh, I'm thinking about so many things. One thing I'm thinking about is sort of in response to what Laynie was saying about how the sections kind of set up a certain logic and then break their own rules. Is a little bit of the way that fear can sometimes work, which is that something that you're afraid of at one point in your life is maybe not necessarily a thing that you're afraid of at a different point in your life. So that's just like one response to something that Laynie was saying. Another thing I was thinking about is like on the broader topic of the list poem, like as a form, list poems to me create both equivalence and distance. In the sense that sometimes list poems can sort of like use that the repeated phrase like some had a fear of to kind of flatten out the distance between different scales of fear. So kind of like what Davy was saying, the difference between fearing heights and fearing Russians, for instance. Like the difference in scale of like those different kinds of fears. But then also the way the list poems also then, and I think the sheer duration of this project, which is why I really laughed when in section 7, some had a fear of duration. It's a very long poem at this point.
So we're in it too, even if we don't have any fears.
I might actually fear duration now, because boy, that was like an endurance effort to like read this poem. So that really made me laugh when we got to that part.
Well, I think also the word, Jerry, the word some, it's a big important word because it really adds up. After a while, we've covered all the sums that are out there that are possible.
And the sum is the whole.
Yeah, it's a pun on some. Jerry, do you want to say something about this poem, or about the list, or about how you organized it?
Well, maybe something about the context in which it was written. Again, I fall back on a kind of friendship collaboration with David Antin.
Antin.
It was not doing talk poems at
yeah.
the time when this began.
Meaning this is an old poem. It goes back to the late 50s, maybe.
No, later than that, but old enough. So much is old. And David has an absolutely marvelous poem called "The Delusions of the Insane: What They Are Afraid of." And he bases it on a monograph by a psychiatrist. Gives lists delusions of the insane, and I think David rearranges the order. And as you go through it, the delusions of the insane begin to become part of the reality of this world. So what they are afraid of, finally it comes down to disasters, bombings, murders, and I think I haven't looked at it in a while, the final phrase, suicide of the soul. It's the delusions of the insane, but it's fears. So that also, I had been doing books like Technicians of the Sacred, and poet friend Carol Rubenstein went out to New Guinea, Borneo, to do some field research, kind of ethnopoetics researcher. And one of the things she came back with was, I think she had really organized things that were given as dreams chanted as a cause and cure for missing souls. And I'll just read the beginning of that, because it's also, fears and delusions and dreams. To dream that one's hair is falling out. To dream that all of one's teeth are falling out. To dream that one is being saved. To dream that one is being nursed. To dream that one is very dirty. To dream that one is dissolving. To dream that one is in mourning as shown by the hair. To dream that one is being beaten on the neck up to the ears, and all about the face. And, it goes on to, so I, part of the time to think of that. And then, the release into a kind of list poem.
Right.
And it goes, certainly earlier than Gertrude Stein.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Whitman for sure.
Well, let's talk about the list poem then. Let's all four of us talk about the list poem. All four of you, excluding me. The list poems have, from Whitman and others, an implicit democratic urge. I really want to cover it all. I don't want to leave anything out. I don't want to be selective. I want to be indiscriminate, non-discriminatory. Okay. This poem does that, but it also, I don't want to say critiques it, but also puts it into question, because there's a lot of fear out there. And I almost want to take a shower afterwards, or I want to find a real democracy afterwards, because everybody's worried about everything. So, Davy, the list poem, the catalog poem, how does it work here? Your thought on that?
So the list poem's inherently comparative. That's saying some have a fear of French and some have a fear of childbirth, necessarily operates to form a comparison between all of the things that some had a fear of, and then the comparison to what the result of having those fears are. So something, Jerry, that you were saying is that some of these fears end up as a symptom of pathology, of being able to be pathologized, that someone might, under certain circumstances, want to treat a person with a fear of childbirth in a way that's different from how someone might respond to another kind of fear and how that fear operates socially. And similarly, thinking about something that I kept asking myself is which of these fears are related to bias and to violent behavior, and which of these fears are not. And having that comparison, I think, in this poem really asks us to think about what the social life of these fears are, and how we're conditioned differently from one another and similarly to one another to attach those fears to certain people or to certain behaviors or to certain appropriate responses, to think about the life around each of the fears.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Laynie, your thought on this?
I'm thinking about how there are so many different reasons to create lists, different impulses. So one of those impulses is to tame the circling thought of the mind, to reduce the fear, is to categorize and list. Could make it worse, could make it better, I don't know, but we tend to make lists. But the way that this
list making is a little therapeutic sometimes, is what you're
Right.
saying, right?
But the
Make
way
a list
that
of your fears.
Yeah, the way that it works in this poem for me, hearing it aloud, it's like an incantation. And so I think the thing that is calming about it is that we're all in here. We all, in other words, if you're afraid, you're not alone. Because if I'm afraid of the water bottle, then somebody else is afraid of the book. We're all in it together, and it's kind of non-ending. It kind of puts it in perspective.
It's such a great point. And being a reader of Jerome Rothenberg's work myself, having read everything that I could get my hands on, especially at a period where I was teaching Jerry's work for a month in a seminar in preparation for a visit that Jerry made for several days. As a Rothenbergian, what you say is not simply about this poem. It is generally what Jerry Rothenberg has done with his work, not just his poetic work, but his critical work, his collecting work, his curatorial work, which is to suggest, in the language of this poem, there's a lot of fear out there, but there's plenty for all of us. So let's all get. It's a very generous, weirdly generous thing to say. Anna, your thought, and then Jerry will have the last extensive word, as much as he'd like.
Once again, hopping off of Laynie's really good point, I was thinking about how this poem is really social, and how you can sort of go along as you read and sort of mark the places where you're like, yep, got that, definitely afraid of spiders, yep, that's me. Afraid
There should be a yes or no
right,
questionnaire.
check yes, if you have a fear of spiders.
Machinery, vehicles, telephones.
Certainly, right? Fear of duration, that's been established. So, there's something about, in the list poem of, recognizing yourself, or of recognizing, this certainly happens in moments of Walt Whitman's poems, where there's, that moment of, that kind of flash moment of recognition of, okay, yeah, this poem is, speaking to something that I fear. Of course, on the flip side of that, the idea that fear can be something that, is really, fear can be isolating if you feel like you're the only one who's afraid of this. When you're a little kid and you feel like that fear of, I've woken up, it's the middle of the night, I'm the only person who's awake in the entire world, and it's really dark, and I am scared. That can be a really isolating thing. And this poem is speaking to, it's not one had a fear of cats, it's some had a fear of cats. There's a recognition that I'm not alone in my fear. And of course, on the flip side of that, it's not just this generous social reading, right? If you're scared of spiders, it's okay, I am too. And there's others over here who are scared of spiders. But there's also fears that are coded, or fears that have fears that are founded in things that aren't like scary bug. They're like racist fears, for instance. So it becomes simultaneously this act of collection and homosociality, and then also a critique of the kinds of collectives that can take, as Davy was saying, like violent action. It's a really good poem.
Jerry, you can add an idea or some more context or respond to all this praise for this poem that went uncollected in a book for many years, decades.
Yeah, and I even forgot that it had been collected in that book because...
You forgot that it was in this book when I suggested that we talk about it.
No, I forgot when I posted it, on Poems and Poetics, the ongoing blog for Jacket 2. And in the note accompanying it, I said, I revealed that it was written about the same time that David was doing, his poem, and mentioned the Carol Rubenstein. And I said, but it was something I never published. Well,
Oops.
I didn't publish it back then, but when Mark Weiss and Junction Press put together the Retrievals book, it was in there. That's where you came across it.
What was it like to re-encounter it years later? What was it like? Did you reread it?
Yeah, I reread it. And I, said,
It's still true?
I want to make this public.
Yeah.
So I put it, on, my immediate access to making it in its, public was Jacket 2.
It's there.
Yeah, it's there. Now about list poems too, there's these what we've been talking about, perhaps a special kind of list poems, of frightening things, scary things. Whitman, can also list occupations. Their list poems don't have to raise feelings of fright and terror.
Right.
But I like them better when they do.
This strikes me as a poem, either a Cold War poem or a poem informed by a lot of the crazy fears that went along with the normal fears.
The crazy fears that have continued into our time.
Well, that's what my question was going to be. This seems to be a poem very relevant to phobias, probably xenophobia being the phobia that's here. Your thought on this?
Well, my thought on this is that that we perhaps thought that with the ending of the Cold War, the psychic collateral results of that, were coming to an end. But the world goes on, and the world goes on with similar dangers and fears, taking different immediate form, much more emphasis on certain parts of the world on religious fears than we had during the Cold War. Xenophobic fears from back into the 1930s, 40s, the Second World War, the Holocaust, as you well know. So it doesn't, for me, it doesn't age when I came across it. It could apply today as it did back in the 1960s, 70s.
I would push it further and say that this is one of your prophecy poems or prophetic poems, because when you write about some had a fear of fear, you're looking back to a famous statement by President Roosevelt. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So that's a historical reference. But when you write about some had a fear of blood, when you read this poem in 1986 or 1987, that becomes a homophobic fear, to be redundant. Yeah. So that this poem has in it all kinds of ways in which we just have to, all you have to do is list all the fears and you're going to leap forward into time.
Yeah. And although it's a long poem, as you noticed when I was reading it, it could have been many times longer. I mean, one could really go on and on and on with this, but.
Maybe you should add an 8th installment with all the newest.
I'll think about
Update
doing
for the
that.
21st century.
This is not the way to end what has been a fabulous conversation, and what Jerry's just been saying is a great way to end rhetorically, but I thought I would throw us off a little by doing one more round. Let's each look at the poem and pick out one line that has a particular political reading that Jerry at the time could not possibly have meant. So I gave A Fear of Blood as, in a way, being about AIDS, even though it wasn't. And then I gave Fear of Fear, which looked back to the Depression. Who wants to try one? Anybody got one?
Yeah, I've got one.
Okay.
In section 7, some had a fear of dampness, thinking about climate crisis and torrential rain.
There you go. Laynie, you got one?
Prone areas.
I think if some had a fear of music, with music being banned, song lyrics and so on.
Mm-hmm. Anna, do you have one?
Some had a fear of inoculation related to current.
Oh, yeah.
That's right. There you go.
I
That
don't
is
even
exactly
want
what
to
I
give
meant by
voice
prophecy.
to the
Yeah.
what that means.
Yeah.
Everyone gets it.
Jerry?
Well, first line that I come with is some had a fear of loneliness.
Yeah. People say there's an epidemic of loneliness
Yeah.
related to crisis of mental health. So I have one. Some had a fear of heredity. Now that science enables us to have real fears of real hereditary problems,
Yeah.
this is a big deal now, whereas it was almost a joke line, I think, originally. Anybody got one
How
more?
about some had a fear of telephones?
My gosh,
Somebody fear
I
of
need a
cell phones.
break. No, you're
Exactly.
totally right.
Yeah.
That is a new thing. And then you just have to take Englishmen, French, Germans, Japanese, Jews, Negroes, Russians, Chinese. You can just pick out your era, and do whatever you want. Anybody got one more?
Some had a fear of responsibility. Need I say more?
I think you should say more.
Republicans have a fear of
Oh,
responsibility.
responsibility. I get it. You mean to the Constitution
Like
and things like
constitutional
that.
responsibility?
Okay. Dave, you got one more?
Yeah, to stay with the climate reading, some had a fear of vehicles.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. See, that wouldn't make as much sense. So he really is a prophet.
I'm a prophet.
Jerry Rothenberg, we're going to put our fingers together and snap for this prophet. We have a prophet in our midst. We are so pleased that you joined us for this discussion. Thank you. The poem is remarkable, and I hope that people seeing this recording of our conversation will go to the poem. You can find it in the ModPo site and at Jacket 2, but you can also find it in this book called Retrievals, which has been published by Junction Press, and it's full of poems that, for some reason or other, didn't make it into Jerry's other books. Davy, thank you.
Think so.
Anna,
Yo.
Laynie, and Jerry, thank you very much.
Thank you.